All right, this is the part two of the Origins of the Cold War video lecture. And last time we talked about the idea of containment that was created by Secretary of State George Kennan, and then further used by and kind of expanded on by Harry Truman. And so when you hear containment or Truman Doctrine, they effectively mean the same. And so that meant that we were going to kind of have this shift in foreign policy. And this is, we see this in that foreign policy outline, what we call NSC 68, which quadruples military spending, kind of keeps a larger standing army. We have a permanent selective service system, which could potentially draft you in to the military if they needed you to. All of these things are ginormous shifts in foreign policy, that start in World War II, but then kind of continue on and keep continuing on. And the idea was that we needed to be firm and vigilant against the spread of communism. We needed to work to contain it. And so we talked last time about really the first kind of test of the containment policy or the Truman Doctrine. It was Turkey and Greece. And so in both of those places, their economies were struggling. Turkey, the Russians wanted to come in and kind of take over the Bosphorus Straits for shipping. Greece, you had a leftist-leaning government that was, not only struggling financially, but also they were, under threat of falling to a communist takeover. And so the United States appropriated, hundreds of millions of dollars to train them to arm their pro-Western leaning governments and armies. And that way they were able to prop themselves up. All right. Now, we're going to talk today about another form of containment. And this one's kind of an economic containment. And that was the idea that kind of gets called the Marshall Plan. And it's called the Marshall Plan after George C. Marshall, the Secretary of State under Truman for the kind of the second part. He really is very critical in terms of formulating this economic aid to Western Europe. And he comes up with this idea that, if we don't do something, people are going to starve, bad things are going to happen. And so we need to act. And the American government agreed. And so, under the Marshall Plan, is really, like I said, an economic arm in terms of containment, or the Truman Doctrine. And under this, within 3 years, I believe we had given over $10 billion to the various countries of Western Europe. So what they had to do is kind of submit a plan of how they would use the money. And then, somehow it would inject like public works projects to rebuild infrastructure and things like that were destroyed during World War II. But, really what you want to think about here is, why would the United States do this? I mean, some of it is humanitarian aid. We definitely want to help these countries, but we also want to make sure that their governments don't turn communist. But even more than that, we want trading partners. We want these countries to be able to build themselves back up. We want to be, the ones that they're going to thank for this, and then they're going to trade with us. So that's really why we did it. Yes, humanitarian effort, but we don't want communism to spread to those countries, which they were kind of threatening to. And then, we wanted to build them up so they could be a trading partner. And what ends up happening is that most of these countries that get Marshall Plan aid, they become part of NATO. So it kind of works out that way, that not only do they become our economic allies, but they're also our military allies as well. All right, off to the Middle East. So this is kind of the beginning of the bad feelings that many countries have towards us. It really starts, I'd say, about 1947, 1948, when really the British and the French, who had, for the most part, since World War I, controlled large parts of the Middle East, they kind of are starting to pull out, and as they pull out of this area, to a large degree, it's us coming in, and what we're going to see is, we have a vested interest in this area for two reasons. One is that there are a large and growing number of Jewish Americans that are lobbying Congress, that are vying to try to get the establishment of, a state of Israel, a Jewish state. And so in 1948, that is accomplished. And almost immediately, this sets off a firestorm of Arab states against the state of Israel, of particular Palestine, who is, caught up in the state of Israel. And, the United States ever since then has been pretty closely wedded to the Israelis. And, if you looked at the Israeli military, it's going to look a lot like the American military, because we sell a lot of military aid to Israel. But that's caused a problem ever since. And you are welcome to decide whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly the Jewish people are entitled to their, access to their homeland. It is likely that if you were to put it to a vote, the Jewish people would still retain power in the government of Israel, because the Palestinians are a minority. But this has been an issue that's been a problem ever since, and American, the American government's had to deal with that. And for the most part, they've sided on the side of Israel. Okay, obviously, the other kind of contentious issue in the Middle East is access to oil. As we get to the 1950s, as we become more and more dependent on oil, oil prices are, through the 60s and 70s will continue to rise, and it is going to make this situation kind of tenuous as we deal with these countries that are Muslim. They don't like what we've done with Israel, and now they rely on us to buy their oil, and we have to rely on them to produce a lot of oil. So this will continue to be a problem, what we'll talk about. And that's why I have on there risky implications. Okay, the election of 1948. So just to kind of set the stage for you, give you a little bit of context. Remember that Truman comes in basically the middle part of 1944. Roosevelt had just been reelected, for the fourth time. And so as Truman, Roosevelt had been elected in 1944. By 1945, the middle part of 1945, that is when Roosevelt dies. So Roosevelt dies in April of 45. And Truman comes in, and really a lot of people see him as a caretaker, as someone who is, New Deal oriented, but he's not really the president. He was the vice president. And so, Truman tries to assert himself doing presidential-like things. He tries to submit what we will later call the fair deal. But he's suffering from kind of a mini post-war recession right after 45. We're going to see that he struggles a little bit with the congressional elections of 1946. So in 1946, the Republicans win both houses of Congress for the first time since 1928. So this is really the first time the Republicans have controlled the legislative branch since Hoover. So that's a lot for Truman to have to deal with. And so almost everything that he does in terms of trying to get legislation passed, it goes nowhere. We're going to look at things like the Taft-Hartley bill, which that Republican Congress passes. Truman vetoes it, and then they just literally in the same day they override him. They override his veto, which today would be unheard of. You rarely see a Congress override a veto within one day. It usually takes a week or a couple of weeks. But his Taft-Hartley veto was overturned in literally a day. So you have to understand that as we lead up to the election of 1948, it didn't look good for Truman. He wasn't tremendously popular at home. And it seemed like the country was leaning more and more conservative. And by the middle of 1948, even his own party had somewhat kind of written him off. The only one, I think, that really thought that Truman could win was himself. And he got after it. He campaigned pretty well. He attacked his opponent. You can see him down there on the bottom left-hand side. Thomas Dewey, governor, and actually Dewey was a popular governor of New York at the time, who people thought he's gonna run away with it. He was gonna win this election, no problem. But Truman got out there and he really started fighting for his programs. When he did so, he split up his party a little bit. And I want to talk about that because most of the time when you split up your party, you're guaranteed to lose an election. Again, that's why a lot of people thought that the Democrats were going to lose this election, because the plan of what becomes the fair deal for Truman, it kind of antagonizes certain elements or groups within his own party. So let's talk about them a little bit. Okay, on the far left, so these are people that are really liberal. They didn't think that Truman was New Deal enough. They didn't think he was doing enough public spending. They didn't think that his civil rights platform was going far enough. And so those people kind of left, at least temporarily, and created this new progressive party under this guy named Henry Wallace. And he was worried more about stuff at home. So that's, like I said, he was kind of more New Deal than Truman was. And I wouldn't say he was, well, I'm sure the Republicans would say he was soft on communism, but he was more favorable to labor unions probably than Truman was. I guess you could say he probably was softer on communism. But then an interesting thing happens on the far right of the Democrats. It's hard to say far right on the Democrats, but on the conservative side of the Democrats, you typically think of the Democrats as left leaning, but there's a conservative element, especially at this time in the South. Okay, and these people kind of come to be known as Dixiecrats. And these Dixiecrats, they are Democrats that basically walk out of the Democratic nomination. They think that Truman is not hard enough on communism. They don't like his progressive reforms, and in particular, they don't like the civil rights platform that Truman has put into his to his platform. And so they're led by this guy named Strom Thurmond. You guys probably won't know this, but Strom Thurmond ends up serving, he doesn't win the presidency, but he ends up serving in Congress for like ever. I think he was in Congress for like close to 50 years. Might have even been over 50 years. He was in there a long time until he passed away a few years ago. All right. So if we look at the map, we can see that I think the most important thing to see about this is Truman reads this as a mandate. Okay, much like Roosevelt did in 32 and 36, Truman kind of sees this as, hey, I won by a pretty fair, comfortable margin. I mean, I got nearly 60% of the Electoral College. And this gives me the free hand to do my fair deal bidding. Now, add to this that Democrats won back both houses of Congress. So they had lost them in 46, and now they gain them back in 48. So really, what we need to understand about that is that it wasn't like whopping margins. The both houses of Congress, yeah, they are controlled by Democrats, but they're probably more moderate Democrats than liberal Democrats. The other thing we see on here are the Dixiecrats. So if you want to take a look at like Tennessee, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, these are anti-civil rights Democrats. That's the best way to put it. Okay, so the states' rights, Strom Thurmond Democrats, the Dixiecrats as they're called, they are states' rights. They are anti-civil rights Democrats, and eventually these guys are going to get kind of wooed by the Republicans, but that doesn't happen until Nixon in the 70s. But right now, this is kind of a schism within the Democratic Party. Okay. So how well did the fair deal do? Well, it was certainly not as successful as the New Deal. Okay. In terms of things that Truman wanted to do, he wanted to expand the Social Security system. He was successful in that. And I guess what you can kind of put down in your notes is Social Security started covering more and more Americans, and more people were added to it. They were given a little bit more money as they retired. So this is an expansion of the Social Security system. The minimum wage, he wanted it raised from 40 to 60. By the time that he was done as president, it was actually up to 75 cents an hour. So that, again, is a victory for labor to some degree. We'll see that Truman's record with labor is a little bit mixed, but this one, is kind of a victory for labor. Okay, he wanted full employment of the workforce. So this is kind of that New Deal part of his Fair Deal, where he wanted to use deficit spending, that Keynesian spending, to try to make sure that there was enough public works projects to build roads and highways and whatever, to try to keep the unemployment rate really low. That one, I would say he had limited success. The Southern Democrats worked against this, the Republicans worked against this. So I would say largely, he did not reach full employment. But again, we're going to see that by the early 50s, the economy's taken off anyways, due to things like the GI Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about later, the housing boom of the suburbs. And so really the problem kind of takes care of itself. Okay, he wanted a Fair Employment Practices Commission. This is part of his civil rights platform. So really, you could say that Truman was probably the first real civil rights president. Lincoln was probably the first civil rights president, but Truman's the second one. The problem with Truman is he doesn't get a lot of his platform accomplished. Whereas Lincoln, you could say really, you could probably credit him for the most part with at least 13th Amendment. You could arguably say his death leads to the 14th and 15th. But Truman, he wanted to create this Fair Employment Practices Commission to make sure that, there wasn't hiring discrimination. He wanted to get rid of poll taxes. He wanted to abolish any kind of voting taxation or voting rights that African Americans had in the South. But what we would say is he was pretty largely unsuccessful with this. Most of that stuff gets struck down by Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats. And so I would say he has pretty limited success. And I'll talk about this later, but probably the main success he had was in the military because he was the commander in chief. And so he could more control that stuff without, another group having a check of power against him. Okay, public housing. Again, this is somewhat successful. The government did end up building, close to 1 million subsidized apartments, houses that, the government covered a considerable amount of the cost for low-income people. So you could point to that and say that it was a success, but it's kind of like aspirin for a migraine. There was a much larger need than what the government delivered. And so I would say, hey, look, that they did some good. They didn't do as much as they probably should have or could have. And the public housing program was not very well funded. They needed more money pumped into it, and they just were unwilling to do it. The government was. All right, and then probably the biggest defeat for Truman, and really probably the first president to ever try to get this passed was FDR. FDR wanted a national health care program where the government paid for everybody's health care, but he kind of had to sacrifice that to get Social Security passed. And once he did, he kind of lost interest in trying to fight for national health care. Truman's the second president to try to get national health care. Those of you that are familiar with kind of current events, that there's been this struggle over what's called Obamacare, which is not national health care, but it's somewhat similar to it. It's never been a popular program in America, whereas the European countries have been doing it for a long time. Medicine in America is privatized, and if a doctor knows that they're high skilled, they can make lots of money. We believe that leads to better healthcare and more advancements in medicine, and we believe that as a country, I'm not saying I do, but I'm just saying our country's attitude has been: if you take national healthcare government and you make it controlled by the government, you are going to lose the incentive to produce better medicine, better doctors, and things like that. And the rich people, quite honestly, don't want to pay for the health care of the poor and what they feel are the lazy. And so we're, I don't know if we'll ever get a true national health care like we see in other countries. Okay. Really quickly, Truman and labor, because I've kind of talked about some of these things. But Truman's record with labor is a little bit interesting. It's a little bit mixed. He is a Democrat, but he doesn't completely favor labor unions. He does on some cases, like in the United Mine Workers strike. He basically has the government seize the mines from the mine owners and operates the mine with the military so that America has coal. And finally, the mine owners relent and they give in to pretty much every demand that John L. Lewis and the United Mine Workers wanted. So that's an example where Truman did fight for the unions. But then in this other big strike of 1946, you have two huge unions go on strike for the railroads and basically paralyzed all railroad activity in 1946. And Truman seized the railroads and basically just ran the railroads and wasn't going to give in to the union demands. And so finally the unions just caved in and they went back to work without any demands being met. So, Truman, in this case, he's kind of I would say somewhat of a friend to labor, as we'll see when I talk about the Taft-Hartley Act. But he's not a complete just to the union side. Okay, probably the biggest thing you need to know concerning Truman and labor is as a result of the congressional election of 1946 that brought in a Republican-controlled Congress, they tried to detooth the Wagner Act of 1935. Remember, the Wagner Act really recognizes unions. It really cements the idea that you cannot use the Sherman Antitrust Act to try to go after unions. And that really is the great moment for unions during the New Deal. Well, in 1947, when the Congress is now controlled by the Republicans, they try to take some of the bite out of the Wagner Act. And so they passed the Labor Management Relations Act, which nobody calls it that. And hopefully you don't see it on the test that way. Everybody else, that teaches U.S. history calls it the Taft-Hartley Act. And the Taft-Hartley Act makes illegal what's called the closed shop. So if you remember the closed shop, it meant that you had to join a union before you worked in a particular industry. And so really what started happening, and this especially happens in the South as we get, if you remember from AP Human Geography, we get this idea of factories moving from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. The southern states started offering what are called right to work laws, where they guaranteed an open shop, which meant that you definitely didn't have to join a union before you got into a particular industry. And this weakens the union because now these people aren't joining from the very beginning, and the unions, especially in the South, they cannot try to coalesce groups and foment strength from the grassroots from the very beginning. And as a result, union membership in the South has never really been that strong. There were certain liberal Democrats that tried to do this thing called Operation Dixie. And you should probably write that down, Operation Dixie, where they tried to get, industrial workers, any kind of workers to join together. But it largely didn't work because the white workers refused to unionize with the black workers. And Operation Dixie kind of failed as a result. Okay, wartime inflation. So we're going to talk about the economy booming. I want to be somewhat careful about this. There's not as big of a post-war depression as there is after World War I. And that's largely because of pent-up savings. People had been saving up really probably since the Great Depression, and during World War II, there was rations going on. And so people had pent-up money. And by the late 1940s, early 1950s, we start to see a consumer spending that really helps out with probably the inflation that occurs after it could have been bad, but it wasn't as bad because of pent up consumer demand, pent up consumer savings. And once the wartime wage controls and price controls were gone, then people were able to spend, and that helped the economy a little bit. But wages didn't go up a whole lot, and prices did. And so Truman was kind of, during his presidency, constantly dealing with inflation. He had to pass measures that would keep prices from going up too high. Now, later we're going to talk about I kind of alluded to this, the GI Bill of Rights which allowed returning veterans, instead of trying to fill those jobs in that they left to the war, instead now they could go to college and now they could get productive skills and training. And when they came out of college, then they would be in tertiary work instead of factory work, instead of secondary work. And so that helped the country out a lot. Furthermore, the GI Bill of Rights created a spending boom in construction because the GI Bill of Rights gave low interest, like a really low interest loans to returning servicemen. And so that created a boom in construction jobs. All right, but Truman did have to deal with wartime inflation, and I would say he's moderately successful in doing so. All right, minorities and labor. For the most part, we see, women leave the workforce, African Americans, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans. They were by far the most hard hit in terms of the boys coming back from the war. Women probably more than any of those other groups left voluntarily. But still, most textbooks will tell you about 70 to 80% of the women that were in the workforce during the war, they stayed in the workforce in some capacity after the war. But typically they got out of factory work and funneled it into some sort of, service work, some sort of tertiary work where they're secretaries or sales clerks or something like that. Okay. Truman and civil rights. I kind of talked about this before. So remember in the Fair Deal, he tried to have the Fair Employment Practices Commission. That didn't go anywhere. He tried to get rid of these things. That didn't go anywhere. The Dixiecrats killed the bill. But the thing that he probably had the most success in was the military, because he had control over that. He was commander-in-chief. So I want to go down a couple there, and I want you to look at discrimination of hiring of government employees. He ordered the military desegregated. It took a few years. The Army and the Marines, they held out kind of the longest, but eventually all of the military branches desegregated. And that's to a large degree because of Truman. And then the other thing that we kind of see as a seed planted is the use of the American government to start going after segregation and racist laws that obviously the South had, and that the rest of American institutions naturally bred. And so Truman encouraged the Justice Department by way of the Attorney General to pursue activities and go after cases that would fight statutes that were discriminatory. And that will bear fruit when we get to the 1950s. We do see a little bit where the Supreme Court's starting to turn. And even though they're a conservative or mostly Republican Supreme Court, as we get into the 50s, they're actually going to start striking down some of those laws that we see throughout the South. So we'll get back to that. Okay, the Red Scare. So with the success of the Soviet Union in World War II, people had associated, some conservatives had associated New Deal with communism. And I mean, hey, look, you have to kind of say, well, I can see where they're coming from when you look at like the AAA or the NRA or something like that, where government is basically controlling that aspect of the economy. But for a number of reasons, we have this secondary Red Scare. Recall that we had one following World War I. And we have a second one, and you could argue probably even a greater Red Scare after World War II. And so there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the Republicans just needed an issue to go after the Democrats. I mean, I know that sounds bad, but that's pretty much what they did. And so they tried to brandish the Democrats as the left-leaners, the people that were soft on communists, and they were the ones allowing China to be lost to communism, Eastern Europe, wherever communism had spread to, North Korea. The Republicans used that to blame the Democrats, who had been in charge for the last 20 years, as allowing those countries to fall to communism. And so they kind of became the party that was tough on communism. And the Democrats, on their end, they had to defend themselves however they could. And Truman really tried to do that. But we see a number of things happen throughout the 40s and then the early 50s where, you can see kind of a reaction against the spread of communism. So we have, as early as 1940, we have the Smith Act, which makes it unlawful to overthrow the government violently. I don't know if you could ever really stop it. You can see that I guess we did kind of stop something to that effect in the Capitol riots earlier in the year. So I don't know if they would categorize that as an attempt at the overthrow of the government, but obviously the people that did that had to face repercussions from it. So, but other than that, I mean, really the only way you could overthrow the government is by constitutionally getting rid of it. That's what the Smith Act says. All right, in that way, no communist could overthrow the government. Now, Truman, on his behalf, he tried to create a couple of programs that would at least make the Democrats appear that they were not soft on communism. So we have the Federal Loyalty Program, in which, like the FBI and other government agencies were given latitude to try to root out people that they thought were a security risk. And so, a couple thousand people lost their jobs. They either resigned or, were dismissed. Because they some way had some sort of connection that connected them with communism or something like that, right? HUAC, which is the House on Un-American Activities Committee. So this is a group within the House of Representatives that, tried to root out people that were doing communist or un-American things, traitors to the state, okay? And so, HUAC, one of the characters that we see that comes to the forefront in HUAC is this guy in the bottom left-hand corner, which is Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon kind of makes a name for himself as being tough on communism. He's later going to run as the vice president to Eisenhower, and he does so because he's kind of the muscle in the anti-communism platform for Eisenhower. Okay, the McCarran Internal Security Act. The McCarran Internal Security Act, really for the most part, I don't think it's like that terribly important, but probably the most important thing that you want to remember about this is that if you were some sort of leftist leaning group, you had to register yourself with the government so that then they could do reconnaissance on you and they could find out if you were a problem or not. And so if you come up with some organization, you just had to register with the government. All right, but arguably the two most concerning events that freaked Americans out and said, maybe we really do have a problem with communism. And that is kind of characterized as what we call subversion of the government. And so the first one was a State Department official named Alger Hiss. And there was a guy by the name of Forrest Whitaker who was actually part of the Communist Party. And he testified under oath from Congress that Alger Hiss, who was part of the U.S. State Department, had passed along information, about nuclear making nuclear weapons, State Department secrets, and he apparently Alger Hiss was passing those along to Forrest Whitaker, who was then passing them along to the Russians. And so Forrest Whitaker was like, he was like, hey, look, this guy has been giving me stuff, and I have proof of it. And he actually produced proof, and people are like, oh my gosh, we have people working in our government that are doing this. And then probably equally as provocative was the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So Ethel Rosenberg, well, first of all, they were both of the Communist Party, and Ethel Rosenberg's brother worked on the Manhattan Project as a machinist, and apparently he was passing along information through her. And then there was another British scientist that was passing along information, but they were just basically telling them how to make a bomb, and then they were giving it to the Russians. And so, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they get tried for treason, and they actually get electrocuted. They go to the electric chair. So I guess you could kind of say the Rosenbergs were kind of like the Sacco and Vanzetti a little bit in terms of the second Red Scare. But they were definitely guilty, and they definitely were more guilty of treason, where Sacco and Vanzetti, they were probably guilty, but we don't know for sure. All right, I have talked about the loss of China. Let's kind of formalize this. So in the late 1940s, Jiang Kai-shek, or Chiang Kai-shek, is I think probably how most people know him in America. His, I guess you could say, pro-Western style of government. I don't know if you'd call it actually democratic, but pro-Western style of government fell to Mao Zedong and the Communist forces of China in 1945. And from the get-go, the United States recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government as the legitimate government. They exiled themselves to what we call today basically Taiwan, or what was known as Formosa at the time. And we didn't recognize China's government that they have now. We didn't recognize them for a long time, till I think the 1970s. So that, this was one of those things that probably the Republicans used against the Democrats quite a bit in the next 20 to 30 years as the Cold War goes on, how America lost China. If you kind of want to think about why is that a big deal? Well, one, communism spread, but China is a very large country, a very large market for American goods, a market to which we had access to before that. And so we kind of lost that. Eventually Nixon of all people comes in and, he's going to pave the way to open trade back up with China, and leading to the massive amount of outsourcing that we do today. But there for several decades, we have a very closed relationship with China, as we do not support the communist forces that take over. Okay. And the Democrats are blamed for this. And like I said, the Republicans use it for many years. Okay. Last major event that we need to talk about, and this kind of leads us up to the end of Truman and into the Eisenhower years, and that is the Korean War. Okay, so the Korean War is really the first, I guess you could say, actual major conflict of the Cold War, and it doesn't, much like the rest of the Cold War, it doesn't directly involve the United States versus the USSR, but both countries are kind of working. The U.S. a little more overtly, the Soviet Union we suspect a little more covertly, but also China as well. This battle between communism and capitalism and democracy versus totalitarian government. All right, so just a little bit of background or context. Korea was controlled by Japan during World War II, before World War II, and then up through World War II. And then once the United States took over Japan, then almost immediately Soviet troops poured into the north of Korea, and then the United States troops poured into the south, and they effectively created a division at the 38th parallel. Okay. Now, it's pretty clear that the North became heavily armed because of the Soviet Union. We don't really know if the Soviet Union encouraged the North Koreans to invade the South. It's likely, but we don't really know that for sure. And then the South was propped up by the United States. But the real issue begins when Truman alludes to the fact that Korea, we believe, is outside of our necessary perimeter for protection. And the North Koreans read that as, okay, well, they're not going to do anything. We think the South's pretty weak. We're going to invade and take over and, create a communist Korea. So in June of 1950, war erupts when the North invades the South. And they pretty quickly are able to take most of the major places in the South, including the capital at Seoul, Korea. Now, for the most part, this is a United Nations operation, but because General Douglas MacArthur is leading that operation and the vast majority of the troops in Korea were from the United States, ostensibly it was a U.S. operation, but officially it was a UN police action, not a war. But everybody calls it today the Korean War. All right. Once MacArthur is put in charge, he launches a counterattack at Incheon in September of 1950 and almost immediately starts pushing the North Koreans back. And he pushes them so far back that they're darn near to China. And so why don't you take a look at that blue line that's up close to China that's in North Korea that says farthest UN advance November 1950. And it just looked like the UN forces were cruising along and that they were going to, as MacArthur put it, liberate North Korea so that they could create an entirely democratic Korea, a capitalist Korea. But once they get up that far to the north, now China starts to freak out because they think that the United States isn't going to stop. And so, backed by Chinese forces, the North Koreans counterattack. And once they counterattack, things are going to start to go really bad for the United States. So bad that they push the UN troops all the way back, and they capture Seoul for a second time. Luckily, they're able to pretty much, hold the line, and then it just kind of goes into a stalemate for a while. Now, I think it's important to understand at this point, and you probably hear a little bit about this. I don't know if it's really something we need to know, but at this point, MacArthur, I think his ego had been bruised a little bit. He's never been like this badly whipped. And so he went to Truman. He wanted to use the atomic weapons. He wanted to open a broader war, not only against North Korea, but now against China as well. And I think Truman probably saw better than that and say, whoa, wait a minute, we're not getting ourselves involved into a broader war. If you bring China into the equation, it's likely you bring the USSR into the equation. And so for several months, Truman and MacArthur fought very bitterly back and forth. And MacArthur thought, hey, I'm the guy. I'm way more powerful. People support me more than Truman. And that got tested. And so he actually wrote a letter to Congress that got out. Truman saw it as a direct violation, or what we call insubordination. And so Truman ended up relieving MacArthur of duty. And, luckily enough for Truman, there was enough support for him and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley, that Truman was able to kind of weather the backlash from basically firing General MacArthur. And, by the time that things kind of started to lay into a prolonged stalemate, what we see is that Truman's going to step out, Eisenhower's going to step in, and part of Eisenhower's platform in 1952 is, hey, if I have to go to Korea myself, I'm going to end the Korean War. We're going to get out of this thing, and we're going to bring our boys back. So that's really what kind of happens. So if we kind of look at the results of the Korean War, you got 53,000 Americans killed. Just to put in perspective, there were, I believe, 58,000 or somewhere near that, 58,000 people that died in Vietnam. So this is a reasonably costly war as wars go for America. I think what's ironic about it is before the Korean War, Korea was roughly divided at the 38th parallel, and after the Korean War, it was reestablished that would be the division between the two countries. And so now they're solidified into North Korea state, which is still today communist, and then you have the South Korean state, which is democratic and becomes one of the Asian tigers, Asian dragons in the economic world, and a capitalist powerhouse. And then it is important to note that there is a buffer zone put in between those two called the demilitarized zone. Okay, if you want to look at this as a positive, I don't know if we really won the war, but for the containment doctrine, for the Truman Doctrine, they did contain communism. Okay, and thus ends the Korean War, and thus ends the part 2 of the origins of the Cold War. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good week.